Welcome to Gangster Echoes. Tonight, let the noise of the world fade away as we take you into the dark alleys, the smoky speakeasies, and the ruthless streets of Chicago, where one man's name would rise above all others. Make yourself comfortable, close your eyes, and allow this story to guide you into rest. Before we begin, don't forget to subscribe to Gangster Echoes for more stories like this. Tell me in the comments where you are watching from and what time it is for you right now. I always enjoy seeing where our listeners are joining from around the world. The night was cool, and the streets of Brooklyn carried the distant hum of voices, the rattling of carts, and the smell of bread from the bakeries that worked through the darkness. It was here, on January 17, 1899, that Alphonse Gabriel Capone was born, the child of Italian immigrants who had left Naples in search of a better life. His father, Gabriele, was a barber with calloused hands and quiet patience, while his mother, Teresa, worked as a seamstress, stitching thread through fabric to help hold the family together. Their home was small, crowded with children, for Al was one of 9. Life was not easy in Brooklyn, but it was honest. His parents had come to America with the dream of stability, of respect, of raising their children away from the hunger they had known in Italy. But the streets outside their door told a different story. Poverty and opportunity lived side by side, and for many boys like Al, the rules of survival were written not in books, but in fists and loyalty. As a young boy, Capone was not unlike the other children who roamed the neighborhood streets. He played stickball in the alleys and laughed as he raced through crowded sidewalks. But he was also quick to anger, and when insulted, his temper burned hotter than most. At school, his teachers saw his sharp mind, but they also saw a boy who refused to bend. When struck by a teacher one day, Al refused to take it quietly. He struck back. That moment sealed his fate in education, for Capone never finished beyond the 6th grade. Books had no hold on him now. The streets would be his classroom. By the time he was a teenager, Brooklyn had given him a different kind of education. The city's gangs were never far from sight. They wore sharp suits even when their shoes had holes, and they carried themselves with a confidence that drew the eyes of every restless boy. Young Capone found work where he could, shining shoes, running errands, but it was in the company of rougher boys that he discovered a new path. One of the first to notice him was Johnny Torrio, a man who moved with quiet power. Torrio was not a brute. He was thoughtful, calm, and calculating. He ran gambling houses and controlled parts of Brooklyn's underworld with a businessman's mind. Torrio would later become a mentor to Capone, but even before that, Al was already learning the rhythm of crime from street gangs like the James Street Boys. It was during these years that Capone earned the mark that would follow him forever. He was working at a bar in Coney Island, one owned by Frankie Yale, another man tied deeply into the world of crime. Al was just a bouncer then, keeping order among drunk men and loud music. One night, after saying something crude to the wrong man's sister, he found himself cut across the face with a knife. The deep wounds slashed across his left cheek, leaving scars that never faded. The nickname was born in blood, Scarface. Capone hated it, and he would never forgive anyone who used it to his face. To him, the scars were not a weakness, but a reminder of the price of disrespect. At home, his mother still saw the boy she had rocked to sleep. To her, Alphonse was her son, one among many. But the streets whispered his new name, and soon they spoke of him with a mixture of fear and respect. Capone married young, to May Coughlin, an Irish girl with a gentle spirit and steady presence. They married in 1918, after the birth of their only son, Albert Francis, known as Sonny. May would stand by him through the storms to come, though she could never have imagined how dark those storms would grow. As the years passed, the pull of Brooklyn tightened around him, but fate and the promise of greater opportunity would soon carry him to Chicago, the city where his name would thunder through history. The move came through Johnny Torrio, the man who had seen something in the young Capone. Torrio himself had relocated to Chicago to work under his uncle, Big Jim Colosimo, who controlled a vast empire of brothels and gambling dens. Torrio brought Al to his side, offering him work and a chance to rise. Chicago was a city unlike any other. Its streets roared with industry, its neighborhoods were thick with immigrants, and its underworld was as alive as the stockyards. But it was 1920 that changed everything. Prohibition began. The United States declared alcohol illegal, and in doing so, opened the greatest opportunity organized crime had ever seen. Chicago, already a city of shadows, became a gold mine for men willing to take risks. Torrio was one of them, and Al Capone was his sharpest weapon. They moved liquor in secret, bribed police to look the other way, and built a network of speakeasies that never slept. What had once been quiet business in backrooms exploded into an empire. Capone was no longer the boy from Brooklyn with scars across his face. In Chicago, he became something else. He was a man of contradictions. To the public, he dressed in fine suits, tipped generously, and smiled for cameras. To his enemies, he was merciless. To his men, he was loyal, demanding loyalty in return. And to the city of Chicago, he became both a curse and a king. By the mid-1920s, Torrio stepped back after an assassination attempt nearly took his life. He retired, leaving the empire in the hands of his protege. Al Capone, still in his 20s, became the undisputed ruler of Chicago's underworld. The breweries, the speakeasies, the gambling dens, and the streets all answered to him. But power came with a cost. Rival gangs fought to take what he had built. Politicians turned on him when the pressure grew too great. And the newspapers, hungry for stories, painted him as the face of America's lawlessness. The boy from Brooklyn, the son of a barber and seamstress, was now the most feared and famous gangster in America. And this is where his story begins to take its darker turns. The path that would lead from riches to blood, from untouchable power to a prison cell. Chicago in the 1920s was a city of two faces. By day, the streets bustled with workers heading to the stockyards, the clang of the elevated trains, and the chatter of merchants selling their goods. By night, the same streets carried whispers of hidden doors, coded knocks, and men carrying crates of whiskey under the cover of darkness. Prohibition had turned the city into a battlefield, and at the center of it stood Al Capone. When Torrio left, Chicago's underworld became Capone's canvas. He was young, only in his mid-20s, but he carried himself with the weight of a man far older. His first move was to expand. He didn't just want a handful of speakeasies. He wanted control of the entire city's thirst. With careful planning and the kind of money only illegal liquor could bring, he bribed police, judges, and even politicians. The phrase on the take became the truth of Chicago's law enforcement, and Capone's money flowed into pockets faster than the government could respond. Yet his empire wasn't built on money alone. It was built on loyalty and fear. Capone believed in rewarding those who stood with him. His men were paid well, treated with respect, and knew that if they stayed loyal, he would look after them. But betrayal carried a cost. In the alleys of Chicago, men who turned their backs on Capone were found in ditches, their loyalty ended with gunfire. The street soon learned that his generosity and his ruthlessness walked hand in hand. Capone's headquarters became the Lexington Hotel, a grand building in the heart of the city. From there, he ruled not with subtlety but with a boldness that shocked the public. He wasn't hiding in shadows. He attended the theater, sat at baseball games, and smiled for photographers. The press couldn't get enough of him. To some, he was a folk hero, a man who gave the people what they wanted when the government had taken it away. To others, he was the very face of corruption, the symbol of everything broken in America. Still, the money kept pouring in. Millions of dollars each year flowed through his hands, enough to buy fleets of cars, fine suits, and properties across the city. But more importantly, it bought influence. Capone wasn't just running liquor. He was weaving himself into the fabric of Chicago itself. Businesses paid him for protection. Judges owed him favors. Police captains looked the other way when his trucks rolled past. In a city that was supposed to be dry, Capone had turned every night into a river of whiskey and gin. But the rise of Capone's empire brought enemies. The North Side Gang, led first by Dean O'Banion and later by Himmy Weiss and Bugs Moran, stood as his greatest rival. They controlled their own breweries and speakeasies, and they refused to bow to Capone's growing power. The tension between the gangs turned Chicago into a war zone. Streets that should have echoed with the laughter of jazz were instead filled with the thunder of gunfire. One of the earliest and most brutal clashes came in 1924, when O'Banion was assassinated in his flower shop. The killing was carried out by Capone's men, though as always, nothing could be directly tied to him. The city knew, of course. Everyone knew. But proof was another matter. The death of O'Banion was not the end of the war, only the spark that lit it brighter. Himmy Weiss stepped up, a man known for his temper and his fearlessness, and he brought the fight to Capone with a fury that shook the city. Drive-by shootings became common. Bullets sprayed from speeding cars in the dead of night. Chicagoans learned to duck at the sound of engines roaring too close. Blood pooled on sidewalks, and newspapers filled their pages with headlines of gangland killings. Through it all, Capone remained calm. To him, it was not chaos but a game, one he intended to win by any means necessary. Despite the violence, Capone maintained an image that confused many. He donated to charities, paid for soup kitchens, and handed out food during the harsh winters. On Thanksgiving, he made sure hundreds of poor families had meals. To some, this made him a hero of the people, a modern-day Robin Hood. But his generosity was never without reason. Every act of kindness strengthened his hold on the city, binding the community to him with invisible chains of loyalty and gratitude. Inside his empire, Capone demanded discipline. He was not reckless, as many thought. He was careful, calculating, and always thinking ahead. He avoided alcohol himself, preferring milk, and he played cards and listened to jazz late into the night. His men followed a strict code. Respect loyalty, avoid unnecessary cruelty, and always protect the business. Those who stepped out of line were dealt with swiftly, but Capone was smart enough to know that fear alone could not hold an empire. Respect was stronger. By 1926, the war between Capone and the North Side Gang had reached its peak. Himmy Weiss, bold and relentless, launched an attack that nearly killed Capone outside the Hawthorne Hotel. Bullets shattered windows and tore through the street, but Capone survived, shaken but alive. He responded not with panic, but with strategy. Weiss himself was soon gunned down, and another name was added to the list of fallen enemies. But there was always another enemy waiting. Bugs Moran, hot-headed and ambitious, now led the North Side. The stage was set for one of the most infamous moments in Capone's story, a moment that would shock America and define his reign forever. Capone's men called him the boss. To them, he was more than just a leader. He was the one who held their world together. To outsiders, he was untouchable, shielded by money, influence, and the silence of witnesses too afraid to speak. But beneath the surface, cracks were forming. The city could not ignore the violence forever, and the federal government was beginning to take notice. Still, for now, Al Capone ruled Chicago. His empire was vast, his enemies weakened, and his name carried a weight that stretched beyond the city to every corner of America. He had risen from a boy in Brooklyn with scars on his face to the most powerful gangster in the country. But the higher he climbed, the more dangerous the fall would become. The winter of 1929 in Chicago was bitter. Snow gathered in gray piles along the streets, and the cold air carried the sound of jazz clubs and the muffled whispers of speakeasies hidden behind locked doors. But beneath that icy silence, a storm was brewing. The rivalry between Al Capone and George "Bugs" Moran had reached its breaking point. The city had already seen blood, but what came next would etch itself into American history forever. On the morning of February 14th, a garage on North Clark Street stood quiet, its red brick walls holding the secrets of the North Side Gang. It was here that Moran's men gathered, unaware that death was waiting for them. Capone himself was not in Chicago that day. He had made sure of it. Instead, he was far away in Florida, lounging in the warmth of the Palm Island estate he had bought, an alibi polished and secure. The work would be done by others. Inside the garage, Moran's men laughed and smoked, unaware of what was coming. Then, a car pulled up outside. Witnesses later said they saw men step out, some dressed in police uniforms, others in plain clothes. They carried shotguns and Thompson submachine guns, weapons that had become the soundtrack of Chicago's underworld. To the men inside, it looked like a raid. No one resisted. They lined up against the wall as if it were routine. What happened next shattered the illusion. The gunman opened fire, filling the garage with the deafening roar of Tommy guns. Bullets tore through the air, cutting down Moran's men in a hailstorm of violence. 7 bodies crumpled to the ground. Their lives ended in an instant. When the shooting stopped, the smell of gunpowder hung heavy in the air, mingling with the chill of February. The St. Valentine's Day massacre was unlike anything the city had ever seen. Chicago had known gangland killings, but this was different. It was methodical, brutal, and cold. Though Capone's name was never proven to be tied directly to the massacre, the city and the nation had no doubts about who had ordered it. To the public, the man known as Scarface had crossed a line that could never be ignored. The news spread quickly. Newspapers printed the gruesome details. Photographs of the bodies lined up against the wall, shocking readers across the country. The massacre became a symbol of the chaos Prohibition had unleashed, a reminder that crime was no longer hidden in shadows, but played out openly in the streets. And at the center of it all stood Al Capone. For Capone, the massacre was both a victory and a curse. His enemies were weakened. Bugs Moran escaped only because he had been late that morning, arriving after the shooting had already begun. But the bloodshed brought more attention than ever before. Politicians in Washington could no longer ignore the reality of organized crime. The image of 7 men slaughtered on Valentine's Day pushed the federal government to act. Still, in Chicago, Capone remained untouchable. He walked the streets in tailored suits, a cigar clenched between his teeth, smiling as if he had nothing to fear. He dined at the best restaurants, tipped waiters with $100 bills, and posed for photographers who could not look away. The people of Chicago whispered his name with a strange mixture of fear and admiration. He had built an empire on bootleg whiskey, and no one seemed able to bring him down. Yet the massacre also revealed something deeper about Capone. It showed that he was willing to go further than anyone else, that he would use any means necessary to secure his place as King of Chicago. To his men, it was proof of his power. To his enemies, it was a warning written in blood. To the city, it was a glimpse into the darkness that ruled their streets. Capone himself tried to shift the blame. He joked to reporters, saying, "They can't collect legal taxes from illegal money." He denied any involvement in the massacre, reminding everyone that he had been in Florida at the time. The law could not touch him with proof, but the stain of that day followed him everywhere. Meanwhile, his empire continued to grow. The breweries kept running, the speakeasies stayed full, and the money poured in faster than ever. But something had changed. The massacre had made Capone more famous, but it had also made him a target. No longer was he just a gangster running liquor in a corrupt city. He was now a national symbol of lawlessness, and the government wanted him stopped. Federal agents, led by men like Eliot Ness and his Untouchables, began tightening the net. Unlike Chicago's police, these men could not be bought. They worked with patience, raiding breweries, seizing trucks, and cutting off the flow of Capone's money. First, Capone laughed them off. To him, they were nothing more than a nuisance. But slowly, they chipped away at his empire, one raid at a time. Still, the public couldn't get enough of him. He was both villain and celebrity, the man everyone wanted to read about. Newspapers followed his every move, from his appearances in nightclubs to his charity work. He held public events, feeding the poor during the Depression, shaking hands with families who had little else to cling to. For those who struggled, he was more than a gangster. He was a man who gave them bread when the government gave them nothing. But beneath that polished image, Capone's world was growing fragile. The massacre had drawn too much attention, and even his wealth and influence couldn't shield him forever. The cracks in his empire were widening, and somewhere in those cracks, the seeds of his downfall had already been planted. In February of 1929, Al Capone was at the height of his power, feared and respected, untouchable in his control of Chicago. But history has shown that the higher a man climbs, the more dangerous his fall becomes. And for Capone, the fall was coming. By 1930, Al Capone stood at the very peak of his empire. Chicago belonged to him, or at least it felt that way. His name echoed in every speakeasy, every police station, and every backroom where deals were made. He had wealth beyond imagination, power beyond politics, and a reputation that stretched across America. But with the St. Valentine's Day massacre fresh in the nation's memory, Capone was no longer just a Chicago problem. He was a national scandal. In Washington, pressure mounted on the federal government to act. The city's own officials were too deep in Capone's pocket to stop him. Judges were bought, police officers were bribed, and witnesses were silenced before they could ever speak. The normal tools of justice seemed useless. If Capone was truly untouchable in Chicago, then the government would need to send men who could not be swayed. That answer came in the form of a young Prohibition agent named Eliot Ness. He was not the most senior man in the department, nor the most experienced, but he carried with him something rarer, a reputation for honesty. Ness was chosen to lead a small team, one handpicked for their resistance to corruption. They would be known as the Untouchables, not because they gave themselves the name, but because Chicago's reporters soon discovered that these men could not be bought. Capone laughed at first. He had seen lawmen come and go, every one of them breaking under the weight of his money or his threats. But Ness and his team were different. They moved quietly, striking at the edges of Capone's empire. They raided warehouses, destroyed brewing equipment, and seized trucks carrying illegal liquor. Each strike cost Capone money, and money was the blood of his empire. The raids were small at first, but they began to add up. Ness knew he could not bring Capone down with a single blow. Instead, he chipped away piece by piece, like carving stone with a chisel. Capone's men tried to bribe them, offering riches to look the other way, but the Untouchables refused. When bribes failed, threats followed. Capone's gang shadowed Ness, trying to intimidate him. Shots were fired into his car one night, but Ness did not back down. His refusal to bend only made his legend grow. Still, Capone remained calm. He had always believed no lawman could truly touch him. He had friends in high places, and he had built his world on fear and loyalty. If Ness wanted to play a game of raids, Capone would weather it. For every brewery destroyed, another one opened. For every truck seized, more rolled down the streets. But beneath his confident smile, Capone began to sense a change. The government was no longer just watching. It was hunting him. Meanwhile, Capone's life in Chicago grew more complicated. He was admired by many in the city, but he was also a target. Rival gangs still tried to chip away at his empire, though none had the strength to match him outright. His name filled the newspapers daily, making him both a celebrity and a villain. Some nights he would sit in the Lexington Hotel, playing cards, sipping milk, and listening to jazz, while just outside the walls reporters scribbled his name into history. Capone also understood the value of image. He wore sharp suits, custom-tailored, and always carried himself with confidence. He once said, "You can get much farther with a kind word and a gun than you can with a kind word alone." It was a line that summed up his philosophy. He was willing to smile, to shake hands, to act the part of a gentleman. But behind that charm was a man who ruled by force. But the cracks were deepening. The massacre had stained his reputation. The Untouchables were costing him money. And in Washington, a new strategy was forming. If Capone could not be taken down for murder or bootlegging, perhaps he could be caught for something simpler. Taxes. The plan was bold in its simplicity. While Capone's empire brought in millions each year, he never reported his earnings. He lived like a king, but on paper he was nearly invisible. The government believed that if they could prove he had evaded taxes, they could finally put him behind bars. It was not the crime of liquor or blood that would undo him, but the crime of numbers. Agents began collecting evidence, tracing Capone's spending, his hidden ledgers, and the money that flowed through his businesses. Accountants and investigators worked tirelessly, building a case piece by piece. It would take time, but they believed it could work. Capone sensed the danger, though he did not yet understand how serious it was. To him, taxes were a joke. How could the government tax illegal money? He dismissed it with laughter, repeating the line to reporters. But the laughter was covering something else. For the first time, Capone faced an enemy he could not bribe, intimidate, or outgun. Numbers could not be silenced with bullets. The people of Chicago still looked at him with divided eyes. To the poor, he remained a strange kind of savior. During the Great Depression, when bread lines stretched around the block and families had nothing to eat, Capone opened a soup kitchen. He fed thousands, giving hot meals to those who had nowhere else to turn. To them, he was a man of the people, a gangster with a heart. But to the law, those meals were nothing more than a mask, hiding the empire of crime behind him. By 1931, the pressure was too heavy to ignore. Capone was indicted for tax evasion, a charge that seemed almost small compared to the weight of his crimes, but one that carried the possibility of real prison time. He laughed again, convinced he could buy his way out. But the government was ready, and for the first time, Capone's untouchable armor began to crack. Chicago watched with fascination. Could it be true? Could the most feared man in America really be brought down not by gang war or bullets, but by unpaid taxes? It seemed almost unbelievable. Yet, as the trial approached, the possibility grew stronger. Capone, the boy from Brooklyn, the king of Chicago, the untouchable Scarface, was facing the one thing he had always dismissed: the law. The fall of Al Capone did not come with the echo of gunfire, nor the clash of rival gangs. It came with the quiet shuffle of papers, the scratching of pens, and the cold weight of the law. By 1931, the government was ready to make its move. Capone was indicted on charges of tax evasion, a crime that seemed so small compared to the violence and empire he had built, but one that carried enough weight to end his reign. Chicago held its breath as the trial drew near. For years, Capone had seemed untouchable. Judges, police, and politicians had all bent to his will. Witnesses disappeared, and cases against him collapsed before they could even begin. But this time felt different. This time, the government had built something solid. Years of work by accountants and investigators had left behind a trail of numbers that even Capone's money could not erase. Capone himself laughed at first. He believed the trial would be nothing more than a performance. To his mind, every jury had a price, and he was more than willing to pay it. Behind the scenes, his men worked quietly, slipping bribes into the right hands, securing promises from jurors before the trial even began. He arrived in court with his usual confidence, dressed sharply, smiling as though he were attending a theater show rather than fighting for his freedom. But the government had prepared for his tricks. At the last moment, Judge James Wilkerson made a move that stunned everyone in the courtroom. Without warning, he swapped out the entire jury for a fresh panel. The jurors Capone had carefully bribed and secured were dismissed, replaced with men who had not been touched by his money. For the first time, Capone's certainty began to falter. The trial itself was a spectacle. Reporters crowded into the courtroom, their pens racing to capture every detail. The people of Chicago watched closely, some rooting for Capone, others eager to see him fall. The prosecution laid out its case with precision. They showed how Capone had lived a life of wealth. Fine suits, expensive cars, lavish parties, while never reporting income to the government. They traced his spending, tied him to hidden ledgers, and presented witnesses who testified about the money that flowed through his empire. Capone's lawyers fought back, trying to paint him as a businessman, as someone unfairly targeted because of his fame. They argued that the numbers were not clear, that the case was built on assumptions. But the evidence was strong, and the shadow of the Valentine's Day massacre hung over everything. The jurors may not have been judging him for murder, but they knew who he was, and they knew what he had done. Through it all, Capone tried to keep his composure. He smiled, joked with reporters, and acted as if the outcome was already written in his favor. But those closest to him began to see the cracks. His temper flared more often. His confidence wavered when the evidence piled higher. He had always believed he was above the law, but now, sitting in that courtroom, he began to realize that even he could not bend the system forever. On October 17, 1931, the verdict was delivered. Al Capone was found guilty on 5 counts of tax evasion. The sentence shocked even him. 11 years in federal prison, a fine of $50,000, court costs, back taxes, and interest that added up to hundreds of thousands more. The man who had ruled Chicago with iron fists and rivers of liquor was led away in handcuffs. His reign finally broken. The city was stunned. For years, Capone had seemed larger than life, a figure beyond the reach of ordinary men. Now he was just another criminal caught in the web of the law. Reporters rushed to capture the moment, their headlines screaming of the king's fall. The people of Chicago whispered the news in speakeasies and on street corners. Some cheered, others mourned, but all knew they were witnessing history. Capone's first stop was the Cook County Jail, but soon he was transferred to Atlanta Penitentiary. For a man who had lived in luxury, prison was a harsh awakening. The concrete walls, the iron bars, the loss of freedom, it all weighed heavily on him. Yet even there, his money and influence tried to follow. Guards were bribed, favors were traded, and for a time, Capone lived more comfortably than most prisoners. But the government was not finished with him. In 1934, Capone was transferred again, this time to a place designed to break even the strongest spirits: Alcatraz. The prison on the island in San Francisco Bay was built to hold the most dangerous and untouchable criminals in America. There would be no bribes here, no backroom deals, no influence. The guards were strict, the rules unyielding, and the isolation crushing. For the first time in his life, Al Capone was truly trapped. At Alcatraz, the king of Chicago became just another number. He was stripped of his fine suits, his cigars, and his power. He worked in the laundry, scrubbing clothes for other inmates, his hands rough and blistered from the labor. The man who once dined in the city's best restaurants now ate from a tin tray in silence. The newspapers still wrote about him, but the stories were different now. He was no longer the untouchable boss. He was a prisoner, broken and fading. Worse than the walls of Alcatraz was the illness that began to consume him. Years earlier, Capone had contracted syphilis, a disease that, untreated, slowly ate away at his body and mind. By the time he arrived at Alcatraz, it had already begun its cruel work. Headaches, confusion, and failing health plagued him. The man who had once commanded armies of men struggled to remember simple things. Still, for a time, Capone clung to the image he had built. He tried to walk with confidence, to smile for the few visitors allowed to see him, but inside he was fading. The world outside moved on without him. Prohibition ended in 1933, removing the very foundation of his empire. The bootlegging wars that had once defined Chicago became a memory, and new names rose in the underworld. Al Capone, once the most feared man in America, was slowly disappearing into history, his empire crumbling, his body betraying him. Life inside Alcatraz was unlike anything Al Capone had ever known. The island stood alone in the cold waters of San Francisco Bay, its rocky cliffs beaten by waves, its prison walls designed to hold men who had once believed they could not be caged. Capone, the king of Chicago, was now inmate number 85, stripped of his name, his power, and his identity. At first, he tried to adjust. He worked in the laundry, folding clothes, scrubbing stains, and following the strict routines of the prison. For a man who had built his life on breaking rules, the endless order of Alcatraz was suffocating. There were no bribes here, no guards to win over with money, no friends in the city to pull strings. Alcatraz was built to be unbreakable, and for Capone, it was a reminder every day that his empire was gone. Yet even inside, his name carried weight. Other prisoners looked at him with a strange mix of respect and curiosity. Some saw him as a legend, others as a broken man. In the dining hall, whispers followed him. Men who once read about him in newspapers now ate across from him, watching as the great Scarface ate the same meals they did. But behind those whispers was also something else: pity. The Capone they saw was not the larger-than-life gangster of old. He was a man fading, his body weak, his mind slipping. The illness that had followed him for years now began to tighten its grip. Syphilis, left untreated for too long, was breaking him from the inside. His memory faltered. His speech grew scattered. At times he seemed confused, lost in thoughts that made little sense. The man who once commanded entire armies of gangsters now struggled to follow simple conversations. Guards noted that he would hum to himself, plucking invisible strings, as if trying to escape into music only he could hear. In 1939, after serving more than 7 years, Capone was released from Alcatraz, but freedom was no longer the prize it once had been. His health was broken, his empire dismantled, and his reputation scarred beyond repair. The Chicago he had once ruled no longer belonged to him. New men had taken his place, new names filled the papers, and the world had changed. Prohibition was gone, and with it, the foundation of the empire that had made him powerful. Capone returned to his estate in Palm Island, Florida, a mansion built in better times, its windows overlooking the warm waters of Biscayne Bay. It should have been a place of peace, but it became a place of decline. Surrounded by family, Capone lived out his final years in a haze of illness. His mind, once sharp and calculating, slipped further into confusion. He wandered the halls of the house, sometimes talking to people who weren't there, sometimes sitting in silence for hours. Visitors who came to see him often left shocked. The man they remembered, the ruthless boss in sharp suits, the untouchable king of Chicago, was gone. In his place was someone broken, someone who no longer resembled the legend. His once powerful presence had been replaced by fragility. He spent his days fishing in the shallow waters by his home, playing with grandchildren, and retreating into memories that often blurred with illusions. The newspapers rarely wrote about him now. His story was no longer one of power, but of decline. To the public, he had become a cautionary tale, a reminder that no empire, no matter how vast, could outlast time. His name still carried weight, but it was the weight of history, not of power. In January of 1947, Al Capone suffered a stroke. His health, already fragile, collapsed further. Soon after, pneumonia set in and then cardiac arrest. On January 25th, the man who had once ruled Chicago's underworld with fire and fear died quietly in his Florida home. He was 48 years old. His funeral was small compared to the life he had lived. There were no grand parades, no public displays of power. Only family and a few close friends gathered to say goodbye. He was buried in Mount Olivet Cemetery in Chicago, the city he had both ruled and scarred, though later his remains were moved to Mount Carmel Cemetery, resting near other figures of the underworld. The world moved on, but the legend of Al Capone never disappeared. His story lived in whispers, in films, in books, in the endless fascination of people who could not forget the man who became both king and criminal. To some, he was a monster, a man who bathed Chicago in blood. To others, he was a strange kind of hero, a man who gave during times when the government gave nothing. But no matter how he was remembered, he remained unforgettable. Al Capone's life was a story of contradictions. He rose from poverty to power, from a scarred boy in Brooklyn to the most famous gangster in American history. He fed the poor, but he also filled the streets with violence. He smiled for the cameras, but he ordered killings in the shadows. He was generous and cruel, charming and terrifying, untouchable and yet, in the end, broken. Chicago still remembers him. The city's history cannot be told without his name echoing through it. The speakeasies, the gang wars, the blood on the sidewalks, all carry his shadow. Al Capone may have died in silence, but his story continues to live, a legend of power, crime, and the price of both. And as the years passed, his image became something more than fact. Movies, novels, and stories shaped him into a symbol. To some, he was a larger-than-life villain. To others, a tragic figure undone not by bullets but by disease. Scarface was gone, but Al Capone, the idea of him, the story of him, remained immortal. The death of Al Capone did not end his story. In truth, it was only the beginning of his legend. Even as his body was lowered into the ground, the world could not let him go. He had been more than a man. He had been a symbol of power, of corruption, of the chaos that Prohibition unleashed on America. His name carried weight, whispered in alleys and printed in bold headlines. And long after his empire had crumbled, the echo of Scarface still rolled through time. Chicago was forever marked by him. The city of jazz, steel, and ambition had also been the city of Capone, and it could not escape that shadow. Tourists came to see the places where he once walked. The Lexington Hotel, where he held court in grand style. The old speakeasies, where liquor flowed in defiance of the law, and the North Clark Street garage, where blood stained the floor on Valentine's Day. Even in death, Capone remained a part of the city's identity, woven into its history like the bricks of its buildings. For some, he was remembered as a monster. They recalled the fear that gripped Chicago, the constant sound of gunfire, the bodies left on sidewalks as rival gangs clashed. They saw Capone not as a hero, but as the man who turned their city into a battlefield. Mothers told their children stories of his cruelty, of the men who vanished after crossing him, of the corruption that rotted the city from the inside out. To them, his name was not a legend, it was a warning. But others remembered something different. They remembered the soup kitchens he opened during the Depression, when families had nothing and the government seemed to look away. They remembered the gifts he gave, the money he spread, the way he carried himself as if he were a protector of the poor. To them, he was not a monster but a Robin Hood of the streets, a man who gave when no one else would. This divide, monster or hero, became a part of his story, a contradiction that would follow him forever. Hollywood soon picked up his name. Films and novels turned Capone into a larger-than-life figure, half villain, half tragic hero. Actors played him on screen, sometimes brutal, sometimes charming, always unforgettable. His scarred face, his cigar, his tilted fedora became symbols of the gangster era. He was no longer just a man from Brooklyn who rose to power in Chicago. He was a myth, a story retold and reshaped to fit the imagination of each generation. And yet, beneath all the stories, the facts of his life remained. He had risen from nothing, carving an empire out of Prohibition. He had ruled through fear and loyalty, generosity and violence. He had outsmarted rivals, outplayed enemies, and outlasted countless challenges. But in the end, he had fallen not to bullets or betrayal, but to the slow decay of disease and the quiet strike of the law. His empire crumbled, his power vanished, but his name endured. Even historians found themselves drawn to him. Books and documentaries explored every detail of his life. His childhood in Brooklyn, his scars, his rise under Johnny Torrio, his wars with the North Side Gang, the massacre, the trial, the prison, the illness, and the end. They studied him not just as a gangster, but as a figure who shaped America's history. Prohibition had made Capone, but Capone had also defined Prohibition. He was both a product of his time and the force that drove it. Chicago itself could never escape him. Even decades later, his presence lingered. Taxi drivers told stories of the places he once ruled. Tour guides pointed out his old haunts. Bars and restaurants boasted of connections to his era. The city's skyline had changed, but in its streets, in its memories, Al Capone's shadow still walked. What made Capone different from other gangsters was not just the empire he built, but the way he carried it. He did not hide in the dark. He walked in daylight, smiling for cameras, shaking hands, dining in public. He turned crime into celebrity, making himself a figure both feared and admired. He was ruthless, yes, but he was also bold, and that boldness made him unforgettable. And in the years after his death, the world began to ask, what did his life mean? Was he proof of the corruption that rotted America in the 1920s? Was he a cautionary tale about power built on violence? Or was he, in some strange way, a symbol of resilience, a man who rose from nothing to become one of the most famous names in history? The answer depends on who you ask. To some, Capone was the darkest chapter of Chicago's past. To others, he was the man who gave life to a city of jazz and grit, who made the world pay attention. And perhaps, in the end, that is why his legend endures, because Al Capone was never just one thing. He was a contradiction, a paradox, a man both feared and admired, hated and loved. As decades passed, children who had once whispered his name grew old, but the story remained. New generations learned it in classrooms, read it in books, saw it on screens. Scarface became eternal, a ghost of the Prohibition era, a reminder that power can rise fast, fall hard, and leave behind an echo that never truly fades. Even now, nearly a century later, his name is spoken with a strange reverence. Not admiration, not always fear, but recognition. Recognition that in the story of America, in the story of Chicago, there was once a man named Al Capone who ruled like a king, who fell like a man, and who lives on as a legend. Even after Al Capone's empire crumbled, the underworld did not vanish. It adapted, it shifted, it learned from him. In many ways, Capone's methods shaped organized crime long after his death. He had shown that power was not only about violence, but also about control of politics, of law enforcement, of the streets, and of public opinion. Capone's success during Prohibition had revealed just how fragile the line between law and corruption could be. He bribed police officers by the dozens, judges by the handful, and even politicians who swore to uphold the law. Money, he proved, could buy silence. Fear could enforce it, and with those two weapons, cash and intimidation, he built an empire stronger than most governments dared to confront. The men who came after him studied those lessons carefully. In New York, Lucky Luciano reorganized the mafia into what became known as the Commission, a system of families that worked together rather than constantly fighting. Luciano had watched Capone closely, and while he admired the Chicago boss's power, he also understood the danger of drawing too much attention. Where Capone had thrived on headlines and publicity, Luciano preferred shadows. He learned from Capone's downfall that the brighter the spotlight, the faster the fall. Other gangsters also carried Capone's lessons forward. They used front businesses to launder money, just as Capone had with his laundry service and his clubs. They invested in politics, ensuring protection at every level. They expanded into new industries, gambling, narcotics, labor unions, all using the same principles Capone had proven worked. In this way, even though Scarface was gone, his fingerprints remained on every corner of organized crime. But Capone's influence stretched beyond the underworld. Law enforcement itself changed because of him. Before Capone, police corruption was often ignored, brushed aside as an unfortunate reality. But the St. Valentine's Day Massacre and Capone's eventual conviction forced the government to act. Federal agencies expanded their power, focusing more heavily on organized crime. The Bureau of Prohibition, though temporary, laid the foundation for the Federal Bureau of Investigation's later work against crime syndicates. Eliot Ness and the Untouchables became national heroes, not only because they fought Capone, but because they symbolized a new kind of law enforcement, relentless, incorruptible, and methodical. The image of Ness, standing firm against Capone's empire, inspired the idea that even the most untouchable criminal could be brought down. Later generations of federal agents would carry that torch into battles against the mafia, drug cartels, and international crime networks. Capone also reshaped how America thought about crime. Before him, gangsters were seen as local figures, small-time thugs who operated in shadows. Capone turned crime into a national headline. His life was followed like a celebrity's, his actions reported in papers across the country. He blurred the line between criminal and cultural icon. Newspapers sold copies with his name in bold letters, Hollywood borrowed his image for villains, and the public could not look away. The truth, of course, was that Capone was both more and less than the legend. He was ruthless, but not all-powerful. He was cunning, but also careless. He was generous, but his generosity served his own ends. He was all of these things at once, a man of contradictions. Yet the legend smoothed those contradictions into a single image, one that fascinated people across the world. Even music carried his name. Jazz songs mentioned him, blues singers hinted at him, and later, in the era of hip-hop, his name became a symbol of power, rebellion, and survival. Al Capone became shorthand for toughness, for fearlessness, for a life lived outside the law. To rap artists and storytellers decades later, Scarface was not just history. He was a metaphor, a reminder that even from the bottom one could rise. And in the streets of Chicago, his ghost still walked. Bars and clubs decorated themselves with his image, using his name to draw curious visitors. Tour guides built entire businesses on his legend, leading people to the spots where he had once ruled, where bullets had once flown. The city that had once cursed his name now sold it, turning his story into an industry of its own. But with all this, a debate lingered. Was Al Capone a villain, or was he something more? To many, he was a symbol of America's dark side, proof of what happens when greed and violence are allowed to thrive. His name was tied to blood, to corruption, to a city scarred by fear. To others, especially in poorer communities, he remained a kind of folk hero, remembered not for the killings but for the bread he gave out, for the image of a man who stood against a government that many felt had failed them. This tension between villain and folk hero was part of why his legend endured. He was never just one thing. He could not be neatly boxed as good or evil. He was both, and that complexity made him unforgettable. The fascination with Capone also came from the era he represented. The 1920s were a time of jazz, flappers, and speakeasies, but also of poverty, inequality, and corruption. Capone embodied both the glamour and the grit. He was the shining suit and the bloody alley, the laughter in a smoky nightclub, and the echo of gunshots on a winter street. He carried with him the contradictions of America itself: hope and despair, wealth and ruin, freedom and lawlessness. And so, decade after decade, his name remained. Children who had never known Prohibition grew up hearing about him. Movies retold his story, songs borrowed his name, and history classes debated his meaning. He became timeless, not because his empire lasted, but because his story captured something deeper: the hunger for power, the cost of violence, and the fragile line between myth and man. To this day, tourists still walk Chicago asking, where did Capone live? Where did he eat? Where did he rule? His story is sold on postcards, echoed in ghost tours, painted on murals. Scarface is no longer feared, but remembered, part gangster, part celebrity, part legend. And perhaps that is what makes his story unique. Most gangsters fade with time, their names forgotten outside dusty history books. But Al Capone did not fade. He became something larger than life, a story that belongs not just to Chicago, but to the world. His face is known, his name is recognized, his legend endures. Al Capone's life, when looked at from beginning to end, reads like a story too sharp to be real. A boy born in Brooklyn to immigrant parents, scarred in a street fight, rises through crime, takes control of Chicago, and becomes one of the most feared and famous men in the world. Yet that same man dies broken, his mind eaten by disease, far from the city he once ruled. It is a story of rise and fall, but also of lessons. Politicians often pointed to Capone as proof of the dangers of corruption, of what happens when greed is allowed to mix with power. His name was used as a warning in speeches, a way to remind the public that no man is above the law. Teachers told his story in classrooms as a lesson about crime, about how wealth and violence may bring power, but never peace. For law enforcement, Capone became a symbol of both failure and victory. He proved how deeply the system could be corrupted, but also how persistence could bring even the strongest empire down. His conviction for tax evasion may have seemed small compared to his crimes, but it sent a message that echoed across the country. No matter how untouchable someone may seem, there is always a way to reach them. For ordinary people, the story was harder to pin down. Some remembered the blood, the fear, the crime-ridden streets. Others remembered the breadlines, the man who gave food when no one else did. That divide never truly faded, and even now, people argue over who Capone really was. Was he a villain, a protector, a businessman, or all of these at once? The truth is that Capone's story carries a mirror. In him, people saw both the worst and the best of what ambition can bring. He was ruthless, but he was also generous. He was cruel, but he was also charming. He was feared, but he was also loved. And perhaps that is why his story has lasted so long, because it reflects something deeper about power itself, about the way it can build, and the way it can destroy. Today, nearly a century after Al Capone's reign, his name still carries a strange power. You can walk through Chicago and find reminders of him in the old buildings, in the stories told by guides, in the photographs behind glass in museums. His shadow lingers not because people admire him, but because they cannot forget him. The world has produced many gangsters, many crime lords, many men who believed themselves untouchable, but none left the same mark as Scarface. His story was not just about crime. It was about a city, an era, a country learning what it meant to fight corruption. It was about the rise of law enforcement as a national power. It was about the way one man could capture the world's attention, not as a king or a president, but as a gangster. And so, as you close your eyes tonight and let this story drift into silence, remember that Al Capone was not only a man of violence, but also a man of contradictions. He was both feared and admired, hated and remembered. His empire turned to dust, but his legend turned to stone. Here on Gangster Echoes, we bring you these stories not only to revisit the past, but to feel its weight, to hear its whispers, to know how the choices of men echo across time. If you enjoyed this story of Al Capone, subscribe to Gangster Echoes for more tales of history's most unforgettable figures. And before you drift to sleep, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from tonight? Close your eyes now, let the city of Chicago fade in your mind, Let the echo of Scarface fade with it, and know that even kings of crime, no matter how powerful, cannot escape time. The untouchable king of Chicago is gone, but his story will always remain.